Hello and welcome to X-Trail. I'm Jewel Forde, your host for this program. Now, elections have been called on January the 19th, as we all know, and so here on the X-Trail, we'll be looking at everything that's going to be taking place on the campaign trail. In this program, we'll be looking at the youth vote. What is encouraging the young people to come out, their thoughts on what has happened with the administration since the last election, and whether or not there's even any reason to come out and vote, as so many young people are saying that they are not voting. Our guests today are Roshanna Trim, she's a youth activist and project coordinator, Devaron Bruce, a political scientist, Alex Downs, a youth activist, and we have a commentator today, Joel Manning. He joins us for The People's Say. We have the results of an unscientific Twitter poll with Kevz Politics, and the question was, do you intend to vote in the January 19th general election? 48.3% said yes, 26.8% said no, and 24.9% they were unsure. So what does that mean? We'll chat with our panel when we come back. And welcome back to X-Trail. My guest today, Roshanna Trim. She's a youth activist and project coordinator. Devaron Bruce, a political scientist, and Alex Downs, a youth activist. And also with us is Jewel Manning for our segment, The People's Say, but he will also be involved in our discussion. Let's look at the 2022 general elections. What are some of the issues that young people care about in this upcoming election campaign? Roshanna, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you so much, Joel. So what I've been seeing would be that young people are concerned about unemployment. They're concerned about the high cost of living, high taxation. And I think those are some of the key issues that we've seen. We've also seen things like integrity legislation and concern that it hasn't been passed or it wasn't able to be passed in the upper house. And those are some of the things that are sticking out. The need for accountability and transparency. Those are really the things that young people are looking at, and those commitments and the manifesto promises that would have been made in 2018 that they're looking to see whether or not those have been fulfilled over the last 3.5, 4 years.
Devaron, your thoughts? What are some of the issues that young people are looking at and expect to see in this election campaign?
Thank you for that, Joel, and thank you for having me, and greetings to the panel as well. I would just reiterate much of what Roshanna has said. The issues are generally issues that people in general are concerned about, not just young persons, because we all have to live in the same society. So unemployment, education, I would add to that, I think it's missing. And some more colloquial issues, things such as areas regarding entrepreneurship, areas regarding sports. It depends on where that young person lies within that society. Obviously, things such as cost of living and the economy, the larger picture being the economy. So those are the major concerns I see that young persons have. Again, it depends on the type of young person you're speaking to, where that young person comes from, and the age group of that young person as well too. So the issues, I believe, are by and large everybody's issues, but certainly more colloquial issues as well too. So that would be my first interjection of the discussion.
Could you argue that you have to put those things though in context? This was not a regular term for any government in any country across the world. I think before they settled in good in 2018, they were trying to correct the economy and the issues with the economy. And before you could get anywhere with that, then you had COVID, and in there you had the ashfall, and then you had so many other things, the hurricane, etc. So it just seems to have gone from one thing to another. So can you put all the things that you and Roshanna mentioned in the context of the other things that have been happening? And could a government say, okay, in light of where we are with COVID and what it is doing to our economy and the impact it's having on the health of our people, integrity legislation is not a priority right now. Yes, we want good governance and accountability, but right now that's not a priority. Could you say that?
Yes, you can make that argument for sure, but interestingly enough, if you go back to manifestos, I believe from the 80s, you were beginning to see that young persons were being brought into the political discussion and their issues being brought into the political discussion. And I would bet you my next salary, for instance, that those issues of the 80s and 90s are still the issues of today. So when we make this argument of now is not the right time to settle some of the major things that need to be settled, we never get to the point where they're ever settled. So we're still talking about unemployment, we're still talking about the economy, we're still talking about cost of living, and these are things that would have been raised, I could argue, 20 years ago, even in a healthier economy. So there are some major issues that we as a society have been unable to settle because we always say now is not the right time to do what is necessary to get it done. Now, certainly, COVID has had a dramatic impact on the ability to do those various things, but by and large, this goes beyond any one administration. Again, I can look back to the 80s and see that no, it's never the right time. There's always something. Before it was COVID, before that it was the economic recession, before that it was the IMF agreement of the 90s, and the 80s is always something that gets in our way as small and developing states. So that's really not any different from any period before, I would argue.
Alex, what could governments possibly do that would settle some of these issues? Because Devaron makes a very good point. These issues are not new issues. I think every generation has complained about high unemployment, has complained about integrity and good governance and transparency and accountability. I remember in my day as a young person when I worked in particular places and we had these conversations, we talked about these things too, but yet they never seem to come to fruition. So what exactly can governments do, or is it that they need greater impact from the citizenry to make them realize how important these matters are?
Thanks for having me on the show again, Joel. And it's a great question, and I would just say that I support, what's been said by the other guests on the show in terms of some of the challenges or issues that young people see in the current climate as we go into the elections. As for solutions, it really is a difficult proposition, I think, because no matter what it is we do or what we talk about, whether it be the cost of living, unemployment, the quality of the jobs available, quality of living, is all colored and shaded by the COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously is not just a local situation, this is global. And so any solutions that you do posit, it has to be done with the understanding that because it's a flexible situation, things can change at any point. And so me saying, something, for example, economic stimulation or support for entrepreneurs in the orange economy or emerging sectors, that's all well and good, but it's all about how the global markets then impact Barbados as a small island. It's very difficult, especially in the midst of the economic situation and the political situation, for I think a lot of people to really grasp this. But that's a consideration that I think the government is really going to have to, take up and explain to the people. As something I'm big on is communicating. Just what are the challenges you really face and the solutions that you may have. You have to be realistic about them. And so, like, if I were to answer your question, colored by all these things I've just said, I think one thing that we can look at is genuine support for entrepreneurs. It's something that's been pushed, becoming an entrepreneur, whether it be through, the YES program or otherwise, but having support. And this ranges from, supporting entrepreneurs that import materials to produce things. We hear the conversations all the time about, challenges in terms of duties and import tariffs that people ultimately have to face. And then as a producer, you have to pass these on to the consumer. And that can sometimes make business difficult. So that's one thing I think that could be considered. Another thing is, again, something we discuss all the time, but greater youth access and stakeholder meetings. For a long time, we've spoken about young people getting involved in, governance and politics and being able to have a voice and have a say. But, what really does that mean? I think we need to take a serious look at how we involve young people in these things so that ultimately, as the poll showed, we don't end up in a situation where people are, jaded and, for all intents and purposes, don't care about the election because they feel as though it's not going to make a difference. So those are just some of the solutions I think that could be put forward.
Thank you very much, Alex. Joel, you're a social media influencer and somebody who's always has your finger on the pulse of what young people are saying on social media. Your thoughts in terms of what some of the issues are that young people care about and expect to see addressed in this election campaign?
All right, well, Joel, thanks for having me. In terms of the issues that young people are facing, I would say everything that was mentioned before, it really comes back down to the simple stuff in terms of opportunity and affordability. But then to go further in terms of what Alex was mentioning before, in terms of what could actually be done or what could be different, simply put, following through. You know, this administration has done well, or would I say done better in terms of the communication aspect of things and trying to involve or at least have people become involved in terms of the conversations. However, what I would say is that where, for the most part, it always comes back down into it is following through. And simply put, regardless of whatever is happening in a country, it is always about what are the tangible things that have come about as a result of you being in the positions that people have actually put you in. So I think simply just there, the only thing that should really encourage people to vote or that people are actually interested in is governments, administrations following through.
Thank you very much. Devaron, coming back to you, where do the youth fall within the electorate? What percentage of the electorate do they make up? And is that an area in which politicians going forth on the campaign trail, do they focus on that particular element of the electorate?
Thank you for that. Interestingly enough, youth get, I would say, a reputation over the years, or has had a reputation over the years for not voting. It's actually nothing new. The most reliable voting bloc tend to be the 50 to 65 voting bloc for politicians across the region. It's largely a numerical game. There's simply more older persons than younger persons, but certainly some of the issues as well relate to the fact that the realities of youth and the realities of persons with greater responsibilities are different. So politics impact youth differently than they may impact a person with a mortgage, a person with a car payment, a person with a land payment, a person that interacts with the governance system and the economic system and the political system more regularly. So again, it's how do you break youth down? Because an 18-year-old that's at home with his mother or his father and being supported, as opposed to a 35-year-old that is now building a house, has car payments and those various things, they see politics and the importance of politics and engagement a lot differently. So youth have never really been a reliable voting bloc. If you look at the mean from the Electoral and Boundaries Commission, for instance, it's the high 50s, almost into the 60s. So it's nothing new. And the real question becomes, how then do we get that statistic change? For instance, you mentioned or showed a graphic where only 50% of the youth were saying they're going to vote. Interestingly enough, that is not considerably worse than the national level or the holistic level, because you have the unsure vote there, which was about 24%, and you just need about 10% of that and maybe 1 or 2% of the persons who said no to get to where the voting population is, which is about 60%, 65% over the last couple of years. So it's not considerably worse, but it's recognizably different.
Much. We're going to take a break, but when we come back, many of you say they're not voting. Why not? Find out on X Trail. And we're back. If you're just joining us, welcome to X Trail. Our guest today, Roshanna Trim, Devaron Bruce, Alex Downs, and Jewel Manning, and we're looking at the youth vote. Now, over the last couple of days, just once the elections have been announced, and even before that, I saw so many young people who are saying on social media that they're just not voting. They feel disillusioned and let down, that the things that matter to them, that were part of the manifesto of the current administration, and they go back to the things that Roshanna talked about: good governance and transparency, accountability, integrity legislation, jobs and the lack of upward mobility, crime and justice, and high cost of living. Those things were supposed to have been addressed, and they were not. And so because of that, they're not voting. Is that a legitimate way to demonstrate to a government that you are dissatisfied with the way they are performing in office? And I'm going to go back the other way now. Joel, I'm going to start with you.
I was hoping it'd come to me first. Is that a legitimate way of expressing oneself? Yes and no. Yes, because, for example, take it in the very realistic sense of something like a strike, you pull back your services, you pull back your vote. However, no, because who are you hurting at the end of the day,
And does anybody really know?
That's the thing,
if you don't vote, who knows?
When you don't vote, it's true, nobody knows that you haven't voted other than you and probably somebody inside your household. But it harms in terms of you are not voting for today. That X that you put today has a lot of significance for today, but very little relevance in terms of the grander scheme of things. Your X is really about 5 years down the road, and that is where a lot of people then do not understand the value of the decision that they're making on that particular day. Hence why I say yes and no. So really and truly, I think that they have a right to feel the way that they do, especially because of like me in the creative field. I can talk about that a little later down if there's opportunity, but there's a right to feel the way you feel. But however, the decision that you're making is not one for today. You feel the way you feel today, but however, you're making a decision for those to come down the road and for yourself down the road. As a result of that, there is an issue with also not voting as well.
Okay, thank you very much. And Alex?
So much like Joel, sorry to steal your answer, if you can call it that. I think it's also a yes and a no. Look, when elections are ever called or discussed, you will find a multitude of reasons for yes, no, maybe so's. Some people have issues on a community level, some people have issues on a national level, and to a certain extent, they're all acceptable and viable, criticisms or concerns they have. However, I've always been a big proponent of voting. I believe that, at least in our current system of elections and so on, you have to vote. And the reason why is because it's not just about how you feel today, much like Joel said. How you feel today could be colored by a number of things. But as the last year and a half has shown us with the pandemic, life can change very quickly. And so when you don't vote and, you allow society to maybe take turns that you yourself are not in favor of, you then set yourself back because of how you felt at current point in time. Whereas as well, for society always, as we've seen in the last election, and perhaps the last election is the best benchmark for that. If I can, I would never forget the last election. It had come off the back of two previous elections where, like any other election, you had your conversations, your flashpoints and so on. But as a young person, it was really critical because what had happened over the last election period, and we talk about things like, the removal of tertiary education, how that impacted young people in university at that point in time. We say that people have short memories, but a lot of things happened that then led to people taking the decisions they did, which ultimately led to that 30-0. And so you can see now, 3.5 years later, the decisions that were made at that time, how they reverberate. And so similarly with this election, I know people are obviously, and young people are upset by a lot of things, which, like I said, legitimate concerns. But again, I think voting is the way to clearly show you're either in favor of or you're not in favor of something. And by doing that, you can then determine, the course that the country takes, as opposed to just being a passenger and, you don't vote, things go the way that you don't want them to go, and then you complain later down the road. And I don't think that's what anyone ultimately wants. So, yeah.
Roshanna, are the young people voting differently to how our parents would have voted? I still remember a time in Barbados when if you lived within a certain house and your parents voted a particular way, that's how the whole house voted. And the household voted that particular party regardless of whether they did well in and out of office or not. Are young people different? Are young people saying, okay, if you do well this term, I'll vote for you. You don't do well, I'm not voting for you?
I don't want to say absolutely, and I don't want to generalize, but because there are young people who are going to be loyal to political parties for various reasons. But I definitely believe that a larger number of young people are saying now that it is going to be merit-based. It is going to be a meritocracy. If you perform, if you deliver, then we are willing to vote for you and give you our support. But that support is not unconditional. It depends on you delivering. It depends on the work that you do. But then there are also a subsection of young people who definitely will not vote because to them, either way, in politics, it doesn't matter. I recently saw some that said A, B, or C, A, B, C, or D. It is all the same. And while I disagree very strongly with that, that really is the sentiment. So there are definitely different young people who vote for different reasons and in different ways. But I do think that a larger number of them are willing to vote based on merit and based on what is being delivered.
Thanks for that. Devaron, do young people, let me go back a little bit. Political scientists always say that there's not a vast difference between the two parties. It's not like in the United States where there's a vast difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. Yes, there are some differences in between the B's and the D's, but they're pretty much of a muchness. Is that why you get this almost apathy towards voting among not just young people, but older persons as well? I know that I have found myself in a headspace response where I said, when I go into the booth, I plan to put C, none of the above, on the ballot, because I was just so disillusioned with what the offerings were and how they had performed in office over the years. So is it that because there's not that wide difference that differentiates the two parties, that you can still get this apathy?
That is certainly one of the considerations, because both the Barbados Labour Party and the Democrat Labour Party are Labour parties. There's some distinctions, but the reality is that as a small developing state, your policy nexus is quite limited. So the political parties don't have a vast policy options at their disposal. So it certainly contributes to some of the apathy that young persons may have. And there's several other things. Again, the fact is that the realities are that our political system is not designed to incorporate young people for very practical reasons. The individuals that run our governments, they're not 25-year-olds. They're persons in their 50s and 60s. So naturally, they would be the ones who are well connected to other 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and young persons are in essence a vehicle to that place. Now, I would challenge the idea of not voting being in essence a good way of showing you're disinterested in the political system. What I would say is that a person's relationship to a society and relationship to a political system and a government is their citizenship. So whether I vote or not, I still have every right to be dissatisfied or satisfied with what's going forward. We should not limit ourselves to participating every 5 years. The discussion really has to be not whether young people want to vote every 5 years, but how do we get them involved on a daily basis? How does our political system involve people on a daily basis? Because it is citizenship that matters, not whether or not you vote. So I think the discussion in itself has to change, and don't begin to tell persons that if you don't vote, what the next 5 years, you lost your say. That's
playing because you didn't vote. But aren't we seeing some steps towards that? Because both political parties there's young socialists, young Democrats. So there is some element of youth involved even at the party level. And those people grow up through the party system. And then you see them come forward to face the electorate. And then we also saw in the Future Barbados panel discussion that the Prime Minister recently had leading up to the changeover to a republic, where she had all these young people who were talking about all these different projects that they're looking at in transformation of Barbados. Doesn't that say something?
That is certainly important, but again, when we speak about youth, there are different demographics of youth. Those are clearly well-educated individuals who obviously have the master's degrees, the political science degrees, the economic degrees, and the university degrees. We have to begin speaking about
these in the boys from what are you talking about? These in the boys from the block.
Exactly. So those are the individuals who are already connected, and again, our political system is rewarding and superseding that same type of connection. Again, it's not yet the individuals who will not vote. Those individuals are very well engaged. The Roshannas and myself, everybody else, we are engaged. We're likely going to vote. But what about?
Let me stop you there. How do we engage the boys on the block? How do we say, okay, yes, you may not have gone to what we in Barbados term a good school. Yes, you may not have the desk job. You ain't go driving a nice car. You don't live in the heights and the terraces. But you still matter. Your voice still matters. Your concerns and questions and comments still matter. So how do we get to meet with the boys on the block outside of every 5 years?
I would tell you that policy is what matters. So instead of finding yourself having to speak to the boy on the block the next 5 years, the next 10 years, ensure that what you do takes them off of the block. Not that there's anything wrong with being on the block, but again, it's really about opportunity. And many of these individuals are what we call street smart. They're not interested in talk. They're not interested in you coming around and behoving them, so to speak. It's simply a reality where they want their realities to change. It's simply a situation where policy now has to bring these people into positions where they are better off than they were before. It's not just about engagement, it's literally about the political outcomes benefiting those individuals, and that's the way to engage, because then I can say to you, when I come back in the next 5 years, that I've done A, B, C, D, and F to improve your life, and you should be coming to tell me that you've done A,
these things have benefited you.
Precisely.
Joel, I'm going to come back to you because you made a comment a little earlier where you talked about you're in the creative sector and you wanted to talk about government putting policies in place that allow the orange economy to bloom. Let's talk about that.
Not even necessarily policy in place, just actions. That is simply it. It's a case whereby time after time after time, you see it being said that, what do you want to happen? They come and say, give us your thoughts on XYZ, let's see what can happen. And then literally is a case whereby 6 months, a year, 2 years pass, and you ask yourself, wait, I remember suggesting XYZ, what became of that, And it's not even a case whereby you want it to be that your suggestion is taken, but what if any suggestions have been taken, what has changed, what has been done, and time after time, especially people or young people in the creative field feel as if, we are here for ideas, but nothing more. We're not actually here for opportunities, because ideas do not equal opportunity. That is something that people have to get past also. So we're just here for ideas, and beyond that, nothing else. So I think that really and truly is just a case of the follow-through aspect of it.
Thank you very much for that. We're going to take a break, but when we come back, we find out what the people are saying with our own Jewel Manning. Stay with us. Welcome back, and if you're just joining us, you're watching Extra. Now we go to a new segment in the program called The People Say, and our guest today is Jewel Manning. Jewel is going to take up some of these comments and questions that are coming from our social media platforms and throw them out to the rest of the guests. Oh, this is going to be good. I'm just going to relax. Jewel, over to you.
Oh, from Jewel to Jewel.
From
let's
Jewel
do this.
to Jewel.
Alrighty, so question number 1 from our audience. I think the early call of this election is definitely unfair and unethical to the contesting parties, notwithstanding that there have been 3.5 years for them to prepare, and by extension, the electorate. So the question here really and truly is, first of all, is it unfair that the Prime Minister has called elections early? Who wants to take that one first?
It's all right. Everyone wants to go.
Well, I would say that it's less about the Prime Minister and more about the power. At the end of the day, whether it's Mia Motley or anybody else, the power remains in the hands of that Prime Minister. And I think the question has to become, do we want that responsibility solely at the hands of a single individual? Because obviously, as the head of a political party, one of your key considerations will be how best to be strategic in your own advantage, which may not very well be the advantage or to the advantage of the country. So even the persons we've received this legal precedent from have moved on. For instance, in the UK, if you want to call an election, an early election, you have to go to Parliament, and both houses obviously have to agree to that. So they've broadened the democratic nature of calling an election. It's supposed to be a democratic exercise. Why then do we leave it in the hands of a single individual? That's not very democratic, is it? So I think going forward, these are discussions that we need to have, because it's not surprising that a head of a political party will act in an interest of that political party. It's not surprising at all.
And say this, but if you're in elective politics, shouldn't you always be ready, simply because you know the Prime Minister have that power and could call the election, another election, the next week if they so desire, as happened in the UK after Theresa May got in. Within, I think, less than a year, she'd gone in and she called an election. So shouldn't you always be ready because you know that this power exists?
Yes. For me, I think that an opposition is a government in waiting. And if you are a government in waiting, that means that you should be ready to govern at any point in time. And therefore, after 3.5 years, I believe that political parties should have been ready. We have heard consistently that the current government is incompetent. It isn't doing what it's supposed to do. It's failing Barbadians. And therefore, if this is the case and you are ready to take on the mantle, as we have heard consistently from other political parties and other spaces, then you should have been ready. Your material should have been there. You should have known your candidates. You should have been in the constituency. And I think that while I understand and I agree to a great extent with Devaron and the point about having a more democratic process, possibly having fixed election dates, I also believe that we have to know that this is the system that you have and act accordingly. I think anything else right now shows that some political parties are not ready to take on the mantle of governance, and that becomes very alarming for Barbadians.
Jewel, back to you.
If I could just
go ahead, Alex.
Next 20 seconds. There's a saying that we all know: don't hate the player, hate the game. All I'm saying is that I agree strongly with what Devaron is saying, and there needs to be a discussion about how we ensure that the call of elections are fair and democratic. But at the same time, the rules are the rules. The rules have applied for the last how many elections that we've been through. And if it is the case that the elections were 3.5 years ago, we went to the ballots, there have been 3.5 years in which persons could have got together, figured out the plan, understanding that there were challenges within the party, obviously then leading to the 30-0. but figure it out and see where you go from there. And in those 3.5 years, I fail to see, and I think many persons, which is, I guess, part of what was been saying there, many persons fail to see that happen. And so a discussion about whether or not, 3.5 years was enough. Elections can be called, as you said, with Theresa May at any point. And so really and truly, as an opposition, is your duty to ensure that you are ready as possible whenever that is called. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the case.
Interesting comments coming from the panel there. The real question is, who are elections designed to benefit? But that is not a question for now. Next question on the screen. Coming in now from the streets of Barbados. Now, in effect, it denies the voting public of a fully prepared alternative to consider voting for, and it's easy to see it as a self-serving strategic move by the current administration. But I don't know what the basis for government's decision was, and while there are rumors, I don't have any opinion on that specifically. So actually, I believe that this is a follow-on from that question before, but thought there, because interesting enough, I mentioned just before I read the second part, who are the elections designed to benefit? Does anybody here view it as a self-serving strategic move?
It might be interpreted as self-serving and strategic, but ultimately political parties are want to win an election. Let us be honest and not idealistic about what a political party. But let me finish. What I'm going to say additionally is that yes, elections are for people. It is a democratic exercise, and at the center of democracy are citizens. But also, we've had 3.5 years. Where have the alternatives been? The alternative presentations of policies, the alternative options. If what we are seeing now is not working, if you believe that this is not in favor of the people, what have your alternatives been? And what would your options be going forward? If it had been called and they had 3 months to prepare, would we now be rushing to create a strategy, to create the manifesto, to decide what the alternatives are going to be? These are not things that should be done overnight. And they should have been there telling Barbadians, these are the options. The government is going wrong in this way, and therefore I offer you this. And that has been absent. And so if you are a government in waiting, you have to have people who believe in your ability to lead. And that cannot be fostered over 2 weeks. It cannot be fostered over 3 months. Trust and confidence are built based on performance, and we haven't seen a performance from many of the actors that are now emerging over the last 3.5 years. And once again, I say that is concerning to citizens of Barbados.
I'm going to jump in here quickly and say, Roshanna, that I agree with you, because there's been so many issues raised over the last 3.5 years, and you have not heard from these parties. And now, as of yesterday, you're now seeing the collaborations of parties now suddenly coming up. Where were you all this time? Because you had to know this day was coming, whether it was coming full 5 years out, full 5 years, 3 months out, or 6 months from the last election day. You had to know this day was coming. And you don't hear them on any of the issues over time, and then magically they appear at election time, and I'm, as a citizen, I'm supposed to put my trust in you because you've now turned up and said, oh, this government is inept. I'm with you on that one. But I go back to the others.
I would jump in here and say, for instance, that this is not the first time we've had this discussion. The Barbados Labour Party in 1986 was also accused of not being ready in 1994. So this actually impacts both electoral, or rather both political parties, or I should say the two major political parties. And there's a very practical reason why that's the case, because persons who work in political parties are by and large volunteers. Particularly when they're opposition. So there's not a whole lot of money that's flowing in certain directions. And then we understand that persons obviously have very practical realities they must eat. And the time being spent on things like policy and policy creation and responses and those various things is a very practical reality that happens in small states like Barbados and across the region, really, where you will not get that level of input at the oppositional level, because they don't have, as they say, the spoils of the state. So there's some very practical reasons why political parties are not ready when elections are called early. And as I said, 86 for the Barbados Labour Party, 94 for the Barbados Labour Party as well. They were caught with their pants down, so to speak, as well. So it's not new.
I just want to add as well, Jewel, like, while I take Devaron's point, I think, especially considering the last election we've had, which by all counts and all metrics was a historic turnout, like in 30-0. Coming off of something like that, there needs to not just be a discussion. We can talk about policies, but there has to be an understanding, I think, from the alternative parties as to looking at how you can regroup so you can present yourself as a viable alternative. Having 3.5 years, yes, we can talk about policies, but it's something as simple as being present in your constituency, being present in your community. No, that's not something you have to do every single day, but I am quite certain, if we were to do the counts and so on, we can ask the question, how many people have actually seen these alternative candidates and parties present? We've had ashfall from a volcano. We've had a hurricane for the first time since Janet. We've had a COVID-19 pandemic. We've had so many things. And how often have you seen any alternatives present? And I think that is a major concern. So it's not necessarily, looking at what alternative policies you present, but have you been available for the people except for these 3 weeks until the next election? I think that is a source of major concern.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because then the real question is, one, I think a lot of people question, how often do you need to see somebody? Do you even need to see somebody? And then the question then becomes, do you see either of them, whether or not current administration or on the flip side of it, in terms of those who are seeking to now represent those constituents? I believe we have another question to come from the streets though, so we're going to head to that one. I understand that some things are now beyond our control, at least for now, especially in this COVID environment. But I want to see a long-term plan to make Barbados a more sustainable country. Thoughts on those who are presenting what should be a long-term plan for sustainability? Because a lot of questions have been raised with regards to recent activities in terms of coral reef damage, in terms of mangroves. There's so much questions about sustainable Barbados, environmental, this and that. Thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think there has been some movement towards making Barbados more self-sustainable. You can examine the work being done on renewable energy and removing that reliance on fossil fuels. There's also been a bit of coral restoration, quite a bit of coral restoration done by the current administration in order to address some of the challenges that we are having as well, and beach restoration. Ultimately, when we talk about self-sustain, as well as if you look at agriculture and the feed program and the kind of work that has been done in that sector as well. However, there's a lot more that can be done to ensure that in our activities that we do not damage our beaches, or that we do not contribute a bit more to erosion. And so I am aware that there's been conversations, and I think it is one of the policies that hotels that build at certain points have to have to engage in some kind of beach restoration. But I do think that that information has to be more public. And I do think it perhaps has to be a lot more available to persons in order for them to see, because I think that's one of the challenges as well, that things may be happening, that policies may be implemented, but persons are not aware, and so they don't know necessarily what the plans are, and that's a very important conversation for us to have, the communication, and Alex mentioned it before.
All right, Alex, I think you want to speak. We're going to commercial break very quickly, but 20 seconds, Alex, go ahead.
Oh, sure. Well, when we speak about sustainability, I just think it's important we understand exactly what we're referring to. In our situation here, we're talking about, how well is Barbados able to deal with change and to continue to develop. And so, we see some instances of that being done, as Roshanna would have mentioned. We're talking about the beaches and the coral reefs. And yes, there are challenges, which I don't think anyone should or could deny. But at the end of the day, again, we need to recognize that Barbados sits as a small island developing state in the Caribbean region, which exists in the global network. And there's so many different conversations we can have about, how much
I believe
we
that's
do,
your
how
20
that
seconds
impacts.
there, Alex. Hey, I sorry to cut you there, but sorry to cut you. I know you have a lot to say on that one, but we have to head to commercial break and we'll be right back on the Extra.
When you're at a lime and somebody starts to say, it's getting late, we gotta head home, that's exactly how I feel. Like, it's getting late and we gotta head home, but we know warming up. In the last few minutes we have, I want to look at the use of social media in this election. We're in the middle of a pandemic, so therefore I figured that social media is going to play a huge role in this election. I've already seen the memes. They're already out and popping. So let's talk a little bit about social media. I'm going to start with you, Alex.
All right, so I'm up first,
You're up
opening the
first.
batting. So, we've seen over the last few years social media, if you want to call it fake news or misinformation, social media has really allowed that to propagate and spread more or less unchecked in a lot of instances. And we can talk about elections, we can talk about COVID misinformation, but it's extremely damaging regardless. And so in this instance, I think more in this election, more so than ever, social media is going to play a critical role. So again, how the parties utilize the social media platforms to engage with constituents, how the constituents themselves express how they feel about what's ever been said or what's happened. I think that's going to be a very important way of swaying, especially the voters, like your perceptions about what's said and what's being done. So, as Joel, you said, you saw a lot of the memes coming up already. It's only been a few days, but I've seen so many memes, which most of them are funny, I'll be honest with you. But they do have a serious point to them. That's genuinely how people feel. When you see them being shared on, whether it be Twitter, whether it be Facebook, WhatsApp, those are people sending them on either because they find them funny, but also because there's probably a hint of truth that they
And they
believe,
resonate with them.
look, and they resonate. And so I think, for the political parties, you should not look at social media as essentially devil's advocate. You need to understand that these are the times you're in. You need to understand how you can utilize the tools available to you, and you have to be cognizant about what's being said. So I think it'll play an extremely important role in this current election.
Because I want to squeeze in all my questions, I'm going to ask each person a different question. So I'm going to come to you, Roshanna. With the new COVID variant, do you think that it's too late to introduce some other type of voting, like in-mail voting or something, so that people aren't standing in lines waiting to vote? Or, worse yet, determine that because of this new COVID variant, you see me, I can set up this one?
I think that it may be too late given what may need to be put in place in order for that to happen. I believe that, but I also believe that possibly that there should have been some consideration given before the election announcement came. And the reason that I say that is because we don't know how long COVID-19 is going to last. We may, knock on wood, still be in a situation similar to this in another year or so. And so with the changes in everything that's been going on, they need to be innovative in general and all those different things. I do believe that there should have been some considerations being given. At this point in time, I think the best perhaps that we can do is to ensure that there are more spaces open. So for example, less persons are voting in a particular space. There's more sanitizing. And all of those different things. I think we're going to have to get creative. But I think that we should have started before. And sometimes I feel like if we are way too reactive and not proactive enough and not seeking to be far-reaching enough in order to change the systems that we have in place in order to make them more responsive to things that might occur, which for example, COVID.
Agreed. Devaron, there's been a lot of talk on the ground that strategists from the current administration has crossed over and is now advising the Democratic Labour Party. Is being a political strategist the same as being an actual politician, or is it just a job and you go where the contract is?
And that is the practical reality. It's a situation where if you have a skill to deliver to someone and they pay you for that skill, you simply head forward with it. Whether or not you have political loyalties, at the end of the day, it's just simply meeting a skill. And I think everybody does it to some degree. So I don't think there's much story there. I guess it's the backstory of the political aspect and the individual being, or a said individual being from the Barbados Labour Party. But that is not new. We have seen strategists move from the Democratic Labour Party to the Barbados Labour Party in the same way we've seen politicians move from one side to the next. So it's nothing unusual, and everybody must eat, as they say.
I get you. Jewel, what do young people think of politicians? Do they think them as honorable, upstanding citizens who are giving of service to their country, or they think they're just out to line their pockets? What do young people in general think about politicians?
What do young people in general think? The honest street answers are not the ones that I'll deliver. But no, it's interesting you asked that because I started to go through my phone and there's something I wrote on January 29, 2014. It says, politics is delaying the action until the issue at hand is no longer relevant. Beyond that, it is those with those promising a better tomorrow when sowing the seeds for a worse today. That is what, even today, now in 2021, I think that a lot of people think about politics and politicians. Flat out is a case of, I remember at a farmer meeting, the late Owen Arthur, He said that, the political landscape at that time was a pantomime in the theater of the absurd. And I would go even further to say that it is those who perform best that are selected. That is literally what the people think right now about politics. Those who speak the best, those who come across the best, regardless of whatever policy it is, that is who is going to win. And that's what people think about politics and politicians at this time. Is that correct? I will not say whether yes or no, but in terms of how people view it right now, it is simply a stage play.
Final question, 30 seconds from each person. Your thoughts on whether or not you think the current administration is going to win a second term. I'm going to start with you, Roshanna.
I think the question is not whether or not they're going to win a second term, given what we are seeing in general. I think the question is whether or not they're going to lose any seats. And I think that is where we are going to have to question. But whether or not they're going to win, I believe that they will.
Okay, Alex, you. And we're seeing some people from the other administration coming back into the floor.
Yeah, much like what Roshanna said, I think it's really a conversation about how we feel about the current administration and then the lack of preparedness of the alternatives. And that's a real balance I think people are really going to have to play at this point. And so it leaves a difficult discussion, As Roshanna said, will they lose seats? Because if they have to lose seats, that means someone else obviously has to gain them. And if you look at the alternatives, you ask yourself, where will that come from? Mm-hmm. Is there anyone who could possibly, offer you something in 3 weeks that they haven't done in the last 3.5 years? I don't believe so. So, I think it's a difficult discussion. Nothing is for sure in life, but I find it hard to see anything else but a BLP victory.
We're seeing some old faces come back in the Democratic Labour Party. Do you think that any of those old faces have a real chance of coming through in this election?
Listen, especially as a young person, we have been here for a few decades. The persons are a lot older than us have seen a star pitch, as what people say. But for what we've seen, the old faces returning, I can speak personally, that doesn't fill me with confidence. And the reason being is that in the prime of my youth, when I was first experiencing the whole electoral system and politics, what I saw was an administration which ultimately Barbadians saw in a similar light and voted them out 30-0. And so to see those old faces returning, it almost gives me PTSD. That's the honest truth. It makes me question, are you coming back with something new, or are you coming back as the last administration? So you're already fearful. So how that plays out over the next 3 weeks, I guess we'll see. But definitely my initial feeling on it was one of dread. That's the honest truth.
Devaron, what do you think?
Well,
so are they going to get a second term, or are they going to lose some seats? And the question is, by how much?
Well, we've never seen in Barbadian history an overturn of 16 seats they will need to form a government. So it's not even a question of who will form the next government. It's a question, again, of how many seats the opposition will gain. And interesting that you raised the question of the returning faces, because the seats that they're in, remember, they carried those seats since 2003. So you've had those seats voting for oppositions as opposed to governments. So we have to be very careful in thinking that those constituencies will not return those individuals, considering they've been very well entrenched in those constituencies almost for 20 years. So quite frankly, you should really keep an eye on those individuals, those 4 individuals in particular.
I think so. Joel, you get the last word.
Okay, so do I think that they'll get it back? If I go straight back to the pantomime, I have not seen any performers who are standing on stage right now that are going to sway the masses. Really and truly, in terms of those who are coming back, they definitely have a solid chance. So the question really does come back, as Roshanna said, to how many seats will they lose? I think flat out that is all it is right now. Based on what we're seeing here right now, it is not a case of who will win. It's just a case of how much will they win.
All right, and I want to thank each and every one of you. This has been so much fun and so informative. Roshanna Trim, youth activist and project coordinator. Devaron Bruce, a political scientist. Alex Downs, a youth activist, and the man who is going to take my job from me, Jewel Manning, our commentator. Thank you so much for watching X-Trail. See you again on Monday. That's when our next program is at 8 o'clock. See you then. Bye-bye.